Well, good morning, and thank you all for travelling so far to be here today. There's a lot of international miles travelled to join us at IMARC today. I guess in the past year we've heard a lot of talk about collaboration between Australia and the EU and the European nations on critical minerals, but Bernhard, from the German perspective, I'm keen to understand, is it just talk, or are we actually starting to see some action?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for having me here today. It's my first time in Australia, it's my first time in Sydney, and I arrived yesterday evening, and what I've seen so far, I definitely will come back. Now to your question. I think it's not only talk, and there are real projects where we can collaborate and where our various means on governmental, on business level come into action. We have in Germany, we have a new raw material fund which is able to invest in equity. That's kind of a paradigm shift in Germany, that the government itself invests in raw material projects and take over shares in raw material projects. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity for projects here in Australia or where, somewhere else to cooperate and to set up like lighthouse projects and to prove that it's not only talking, it's real action, as words speak louder, actions speak louder than words.
And I think from memory this year, we might have seen some German government cooperation with Arafura Rare Earths.
Right.
Is that?
That's another instrument, another German instrument, the loan, a loan guarantee, a united loan guarantee. And we've offered that to Siemens Gamesa for the project you just mentioned.
And Benjamin, from the French perspective, I know you guys have multiple policies to try and support critical minerals, but perhaps the one of most relevance to this audience is one where you're offering loan guarantees, is that right? And that can potentially be for an Australian miner working in Australia?
Yes, exactly. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. It's my second time, in fact, in IMARC and in Sydney. We signed an agreement with the government of Australia 1.5 years ago. And as my colleague said, we are entering into a project discussion. And for that, we have several financial tools, I would say a toolbox. One, and it's quite similar with what Germany is doing. We have a fund, a critical mineral fund, that takes minority stakes, that can take minority stakes in projects. It will be a €2 billion fund. It's run by a company called Infravia, the private company. And we also have a loan guarantee. So the principle is quite simple. I would say, for example, if you have a project here in Australia and X% of the output goes to France, then we can guarantee X% of the loans that are used in this project. So I think it's a very powerful instrument. It's, I think, similar that, and can be combined. And all these instruments, you know, they can be combined if you have a French company and a German company, because you have to diversify your customer, generally speaking. So I think it's a very powerful tool because, as we know, financing in the critical mineral area is very challenging. Equity financing is, but also banking financing is. And to accelerate the project, we have to diminish the risk for all the financial players, and this is a way to diminish the risk. And in Australia, of course, it's not a country risk, not a currency risk, but it's a technical risk, because, or a price risk. So there are all kinds of risks that we can take. It's a huge effort by our government, because we take the risk on the shoulder of the French or the German taxpayer. But it's worth it if we have a good project and if it benefits to European industry and Australian industry. I think it's worth it.
Great. And Allard, from the Netherlands perspective, you know, the Netherlands is a nation of small geographic size, densely populated, and that's a combination that traditionally is difficult for the mining industry to work with. But I guess the Netherlands does have a very proud maritime history. You know, your ports are some of the biggest industrial ports in Europe. Is that the way you guys are thinking about your ability to play in critical minerals in Europe? I guess it's the portal into the continent?
Yeah, and also from my perspective, thank you for having me. It's fair to say that indeed the Netherlands, as it is a small country, it's very much connected to the industrial activities in France and in Germany. There's various German prime ministers and statesmen who've declared the port of Rotterdam to be the German port and critical, if you like, modality and gateway into Northwest Europe. So I thoroughly enjoy collaborating with my colleagues from Germany and France to assess where we could actually create the benefits, use the very strong infrastructure, the interconnectivity of the various industrial activities, acknowledge the opportunities that, for instance, sit here in Australia to set up new value chains, bringing prosperity, but also more resilient, from a critical raw materials perspective, resilient value chains into the Northwest European industrial domain. Which is not to say that it's not all of Europe that should actually pay attention to this particular issue. But it's fair to say that I much rather prefer to work with what I would describe as a coalition of the willing than the mother of all coalitions. And because our industrial activities are so intertwined and connected by the umbilical cord, it makes imminent sense to look at the efficiencies that can be generated. Because if we conclude that the current value chains are often premised on volume and cost, and if we wish to change the domain, then the cost associated to once the product is in Europe needs to be as low as possible, and the supplies need to be as efficient as we can. So hence I do believe that there's a role for the Netherlands to play, in addition to the mere fact that we also have an investment fund which is called Invest International. We have an insurance facility via Atradius, so that we can play our part from a financial perspective. But I do think that the logistics element is probably our USP for that matter.
Absolutely. And so, you know, we've seen with rare earths in particular, some jurisdictions are nervous about the low-level radioactivity that exists in rare earths. Is the Dutch government, you know, having an industrialised sort of port infrastructure as you do you guys see yourself as willing to sort of be the host of, you know, the reception point and maybe hosting a sort of a rare earth refinery type downstream presence?
Yeah, most certainly, because I think the one thing the Dutch are very much used to, which I believe is essential, truly essential to get this shift going, which is a collaboration between public and private entities and organizations. So the public-private partnership development, business development, collaboration on investments in infrastructure, roles and responsibilities is something that is very much intertwined in our DNA. And I sincerely believe that we don't only need companies that have an awareness of the role they need to play from a geopolitical perspective and a responsibility vis-a-vis building up more resiliency, but I do think it needs governments to understand in depth the needs by these private enterprises. So from a public-private partnership perspective, I think the Dutch have shown over decades that is a domain that we're very familiar with, which I again would hope to bring to this equation as well.
So if we put ourselves in the shoes of the people in the audience, they might have an Australian mining company with an Australian project, and they might be excited to hear that all these countries are, you know, there to help. But I guess they might not know where to start, right? Because, you know, here we have 3 countries represented. We also know that coming out of Brussels at the EU level, there are critical minerals policies. Is there a way for someone who's in the audience today to put in one application and via that single entry point access all 3 of your nation's funds plus the 4th at the EU level? Or do you sort of have your elbows out and competing with each other for the best deal? You have a crack at that, Bernhard, if you'd like first.
Okay. No, I mean, I totally agree with what Benjamin and Allard said. And of course, we sit here as 3 representatives from 3 European countries. But as Benjamin said, our tools, our instruments can be also combined. So it's important to understand that in the end, we have more or less a European perspective, but the instruments are mostly within the national governments. So if there are projects and if you are interested in getting in touch with us, I invite you to come to the German pavilion here on the fair, or to contact the KfW, which is the company that that runs this this German raw material fund, and of course there's then also the possibility to cooperate with the other instruments on the European level. And I guess the same would be true for Benjamin.
Yes, clearly, our minister met a year ago and said to us, okay, you will coordinate the fund initiative, and that's the two funds are talking together, and they will work on a very pragmatic and case-by-case basis, because it's business, you know, it's not governmental application. It's not an administrative process. It's a process run by professionals, and they have the instruction to cooperate, and they have, you know, an interest in cooperating. Why? Because they want to divide the risk or to share the risk. And there are minority stakeholders. On both funds, there will be minority stakeholders in project. So for me, it's not, this part of coordinating the instrument will not be difficult. What is the difficult part is on the company side to link Australian company to European company on different sides of the supply chain, and sometimes with a few steps behind these two partners. So, I mean, you have a mining operation, you have an automaker. Between these two, you have different kind of company that are in the value chain. That can be the difficult part, more, I would say, on the business side of cooperating on different parts of the supply chain that are not used to cooperate, because today they trade on each step separately. So for me, that's the big challenge that we have, that you have here in Australia and that we have in Europe, is to connect, if you want to realize the goal that our political authority decided, which is securing minerals for Europe and giving for Australia new clients, diversifying its client portfolio on the benefit of all. We have to do this work on the supply chain, and it's the difficult part. And that's what we are working also with the Australian government. We decided to have a joint group to identify precisely what are the priority for the French industry and what are the different steps of the supply chain. So we made a detailed cartography of all the supply chain to be able to make this trade or this connection between the company. I'm sure that we'll do, as civil servant, the best to coordinate, and also with the government of Australia, because and the states in Australia, because they also have support mechanism, and we, government, will do the necessary things to coordinate.
Excellent. Would you agree?
Yeah, so I'll be short on this particular issue, because I do agree, but I would also encourage Australian companies in the area of critical raw materials to dare to think big. I'm not aware of any LNG scheme or coal scheme that is a point-to-point solution. You don't develop LNG schemes at a point-to-point one customer solution. You develop it with a portfolio of activities, you de-risk, and you can actually get to scale. And on this particular issue, it's exactly the same. The scale might be different, but the de-risking and the diversification and providing thus security and being able to operate at scale and thus be competitive with major players isn't any different whatsoever. So I would encourage Australian companies to think big and enter either via one of the three here at the stage, and we'll find each other to ensure that there's a greater offtake opportunity.
Excellent.
Maybe I can make a remark on that, which is very important. If you look on the automaker perspective, they build millions of cars, so they need millions of tons of materials. They will not be able to deal with each junior company that makes a medium or small quantity of material. So there will be a need for aggregation of demand, but also of aggregation of supply, which is, I think, a very new thing on the mining industry, because, you know, you have big players, but you also have a lot of small players, And if you look at the cartography here in Australia, you have both things. So the big one, they can deal directly with the automaker and provide huge quantity. But the small one, they will have to find one way or another to aggregate the demand, because our fund or our loan guarantee will not be able to deal with every small quantity or medium quantity.
So does that mean we might see a single buying desk from, say, the French or the European perspective?
No, we are not at that stage. But my message is that we have this subject on the European side of having coordination between the company and also the government. But I think it's also true for the mining industry on your side, but it's the same in Canada, it's the same in all parts of the world, where you have a very diversified industry with big players, but also small or medium players.
Yeah, okay. And so I guess today, particularly for the purposes of this panel, there are 4 elephants in the room here with us today. Those elephants are China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. They are the 4 countries deemed foreign entities of concern by the US government as they consider subsidies for critical minerals. And, you know, we sort of like to talk around it, but really that's why our nations are collaborating, right? It's about the idea of not wanting certain nations to have a stranglehold over supply. So Australian miners are now used to this idea that if they want to qualify for US government subsidies, they have to meet the foreign entity of concern rules. And one that particularly applies to the local lithium industry is the idea that if you have more than 25% shareholding by a Chinese company, you're ruled out of US subsidies. How's Europe thinking about foreign entities of concern? Allard, for example, if there's an Australian company that has a Chinese shareholder at 26%, are they still eligible for support under your programs?
So the Dutch government doesn't have set strict percentages, but it's clear that the key driver is security of supply. I sincerely believe that security of supply is generated via diversification of supply, but if the diversified suppliers are owned by Chinese enterprises, of which we have a concern, then it doesn't cut mustard, right? So it's not the particular percentages, it's the statutory rights and obligations that sit within that company that will determine the extent to which we believe this is adding to the resiliency or it's not adding to the resiliency. But it would be silly to put all your effort into an enterprise which is ultimately via all kinds of setups co-owned by the Chinese or the Russians for that matter. That is not what we aspire to achieve. But neither is it rocket science. So if there's a minority shareholding by an enterprise, and certainly it shouldn't be a Russian enterprise, it shouldn't be a North Korean enterprise, but if it's a Chinese enterprise and it has a minority stake and no statutory rights to determine what the sales process should look like, nor related to the intellectual property, it's a different debate altogether. But in the end of the day, I would hope that there's sufficient opportunities where we could steer away from this particular predicament and actually appreciate what Europe may be able to bring from a demand perspective, and acknowledging that this over-dependency or lack of resiliency in the European ecosystem is of relevance, and that parties will be prepared to create new value chains in order to address this particular issue. So let's not focus too much on the exceptions to the rule. Let's focus on the mass, which I believe truly has an opportunity to generate new value chains with the European demand, and thus providing greater resiliency to the European industrial ecosystem.
So am I hearing you right that you guys will make a qualitative judgment on a case-by-case rather than the American approach, which is to set a hard number, and if you miss that, you're out?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And by the way, the country you mentioned, they are not all on the same situation. I mean, there are some cases where there are sanctions and legislation that are precise, so have to be distinguished. And I agree with what has been said. We are pragmatic, and it's also a question of, the decision also of the Australian government. If it allows some foreign investor to go in mining, it's up also to the Australian government to be sure that this entity will be compliant and will respect all kind of law. So in this subject, if we have an issue, we will discuss that kind of issue with the Australian government, because at the end of the day, it's also government-to-government discussion.
Mm.
Maybe I just added from a German perspective, but as it was previously said, you have to differentiate. Which is clear is that there are can't be projects in countries that are subject to sanctions, so we can't support kind of projects of this kind. But then we have to, if it's about project in other countries, then we have to look on a case-by-case basis, especially also who are the shareholders. But in the end, I mean, the whole target is that we de-risk somehow, and that we reduce the dependency from just one single country. And therefore, I mean, that's not a strict rule, but therefore I would guess that on a case-by-case basis, we would critically assess whether these conditions are given or not, and therefore, as I said, it's on a case-by-case basis, but if there's a Chinese minority share in a project, then it has to be proven that the project itself contributes to safeguarding the supply of raw materials for Europe.
Fair enough. Now, one of the big ways that Australia has asked Europe to help in the past couple of years on critical minerals is about this idea of perhaps paying a green premium, you know, this idea that, and it's a contested idea in some cases, but the idea that an Australian nickel mine will produce nickel with better ESG standards and lower carbon footprint than one in another unnamed country, brackets Indonesia. And of course, Resources Minister Madeleine King referenced this in her speech this morning. How realistic is it for this Australian audience to expect European manufacturers, so BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Renault, Airbus, to pay a green premium for the critical minerals that are produced here? Are we in dreamland talking about this, or is there actually a prospect of it happening? Benjamin?
So first of all, I think the question of ESG is key for the car makers and for the industry in general, and for the government. So this question is, of course, it's a necessity to have a good ESG condition for mining. Then there is the question of how you get some kind of premium or some kind of price. But this raises the question of how this price is formed. So in my view, the first question to ask is, are the miners and the automakers agreeing to trade on a long-term basis? Not with index on spot markets, because for the car makers, maybe they will be able to pay a premium, but they need security also on the price. So you can't have a system that works just one way. I mean, it protects you from the low price, but you get the upside on the high price. It won't work. I mean, if the idea of the mining industry is to have that kind of situation, I agree that it's a dream. But if the mining industry and the automaker are able to define a way to trade on long-term basis, on base also of cost of projects, that gives a protection to the miner in the period where the prices are low, but a protection to the automaker when the prices are high, then maybe it's not a dream. And you know, we have done that kind of trade in energy. We have long-term contract on a significant, important energy such like liquefied natural gas. And so it's a different way to trade than it's done today. And all the stakeholders have to agree on that and find a way to have this premium for the good ESG condition, but at the same time a protection for the automakers, because the critical material will be a significant amount of price of the car, and you cannot have this volatility, which is a problem for the car makers.
Yeah. Allard?
Yeah, so I agree, but I'm not going to repeat, but this issue of price often emerges at the very, very, very early start of any discussion. And it's actually a bit of a misunderstanding, because yes, price is very vital, very important, and there need to be a carrot and there need to be a stick, but it's the full suite of opportunities and consequences and alternatives and security and offsets and pledges and commitments and all that stuff that comes into the frame as well. So don't start with this notion of the price is not competitive. Start with the notion of we're trying to open up new value chains. From a supplier's perspective, from a user's perspective, there's merit into creating these new value chains. There's benefits to be had, there's benefits to be shared, and ultimately you will end up on a price level which is appropriate and justifiable, and that will justify a return on investment, which is sustainable as well. A private enterprise needs to make a return on its investment, otherwise you're not in business in the longer term. So that's a sustainability perspective just as much. But I often witness that people start with this issue of it's too expensive or it can't be done, and they refuse to dig deeper and have a richer understanding of the full suite of activities that come into the frame, and that should mitigate against this particular exposure element.
And Bernhard, a green premium.
Yeah, maybe just one remark to add. Just mentioned green premium. So take the product carbon footprint, for instance. So first of all, we have to get a better understanding or a common understanding of what is green. What is really green steel, what is green nickel, what is green cement. So it's about common standards and common definitions. Therefore, we just published a strategy on green lead markets in Germany, and also on European level there's a discussion on green lead markets. So we have to develop these green markets, and the first step is to agree on standards on a European, on an international level, what the green products are and what the product carbon footprint is like.
Fantastic. Well, we are out of time, so I'll attempt Dankeschön. Merci beaucoup. Allard, I can see it. I've got no Dutch.
I'm waiting for it.
Thank you all very much for coming along. We appreciate it, and hope the rest of the conference is a success for you. Thank you. Please welcome.
Thank you.
Please farewell.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bernhard. Well done.